And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Yoga-Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita and how they relate. So, the first thing I want to say is that the study of these scriptural texts and traditions as a kind of rigorous field of academic study is still relatively young. And there are changes and discoveries and breakthroughs that happen in the field. And I think that's important to mention. It seems obvious, and yet in the yoga world, a lot of people just sort of assume that, well, this is an ancient tradition, and we know pretty much everything there is to know about these sources, and that's really not true. So I think it's fascinating and wonderful that scholars, especially the a newer generation of scholars, are making new discoveries about these texts and traditions, and the consensus does in fact shift over time, and that those shifts in consensus of scholarly opinion can take a while to reach the sort of general public. So there are many things that are being discussed amongst academics and scholar practitioners that are not yet generally known. And just to give one example, in the last 10 years, a German scholar, I think he's German, he's European, named Philip Maas, made the argument, with a lot of evidence to support it, that the oldest commentary on the Yoga-Sutra, which is attributed to Vyāsa, is in fact by Patanjali himself. Now, this doesn't exactly constitute a discovery, of course. It's rather a new argument, but scholarly opinion is starting to shift quite strongly in the direction of this view. Now, it bears mentioning that this oldest commentary on the Yoga-Sutra, attributed to Vyāsa, well, the name Vyāsa itself actually just means editor. And it's sort of not really a name, and this is part of why so many texts get attributed to Vyāsa in the tradition. It's said that Vyāsa compiled the Puranas and Vyāsa wrote down the Mahabharata and so on. And in modern India, people sort of assume that this is a real figure, a kind of a person, a historical personage who did all this, and that it's all the same guy named Vyāsa. But of course, since Vyāsa, one of the meanings is editor, it's just, it's really not the case that there's a specific person who did all of this. In fact, of course, many different people, many different editors compiled the Puranas, which means the ancient lore, the mythology, and texts on Hindu religion, you might say. So that's a bit of a giveaway in a sense. But scholars for a long time thought the commentary was by somebody different from Patanjali, even though we don't know his specific name. For that matter, we don't know Patanjali's name because the Yoga-Sutra gets attributed to Patanjali because Patanjali is the author of the Mahabhashya, the great commentary on Panini's grammar. And there was a kind of desire in the tradition to have these three different texts, specifically this text on grammar, the Yoga-Sutra, and another text on Ayurveda, to have them all be authored by the same person was something that the tradition wanted for a very specific reason, which is to say that the idea is that Ayurveda and Yoga-Sutra and grammar, the study of grammar, are thought to be complementary and interrelated disciplines. Okay, so it seems to me that the reason for attributing them all, these three different sources, specific text on Ayurveda, the Mahabhashya, and the Yoga-Sutra, attributing them all to the same person, Patanjali, is a way of saying that you need all of these. These are interrelated disciplines in a certain way, and some people We find ancient commentators who make the argument that grammar is for the cultivation of the mind, mental acuity and discipline, and Ayurveda is for the cultivation of the body, and yoga is for the cultivation of the soul, as it were. So anyway, the point is we don't know anything about the person who wrote the Yoga-Sutra. We don't really even know his name for sure. I mean, maybe it was Patanjali, but it seems somewhat unlikely for more reasons that I won't get into now. But anyway, the point is, regardless of who these people were, and we often don't know anything about an author other than the ideas that he expresses in the text that he wrote. But it doesn't matter. The interesting thing here in this particular discussion is whether indeed the oldest commentary is written by the same person who wrote the sutras. Now, if it is, that's quite important, because it means that the text that we're dealing with is not, in fact, 196 sutras. It's a larger work. It's 196 sutras and a commentary on those sutras. This is called an auto-commentary by scholars, meaning that when the author of the sutras then comments on them, on his own sutras. And so, again, we're not sure that this is the case, but there seem to be very good reasons for thinking that it is. And if it is, that compels us to look more closely at that oldest commentary previously attributed to Vyāsa, and to take the text as a whole. And that's exactly what scholars are doing now. And they're calling this whole text the Patañjali Yoga-sūtra, because that's what it calls itself in the manuscripts that we have. So perhaps even the name Yoga-Sutra is not, in fact, the correct name. In all the oldest manuscripts, we find that the text calls itself the Patañjali Yoga-sūtra, or, probably this is a title given by scribes at some point along the way. But it shows that the scribes themselves thought of the text as a whole, and it's telling that we don't have a Sutrapata manuscript, meaning to say there's no manuscript of the sutras by themselves. It's always sutras plus this oldest commentary and possibly plus more commentaries, right? But we don't find the sutras by themselves, so that itself is telling. So in Mallinson and Singleton's new book, which I'll hold up here, The Roots of Yoga, which just came out in paperback in North America this week. So it definitely has some cutting-edge research in it. And in this book, Mallinson does use that title, the Patañjali Yoga-sūtra. So when we look at the commentary, it clarifies some key issues in the sutras. And again, if the scholarly argument is correct, it behooves practitioners who are interested in studying this source to look at that commentary. And, we don't have any very readable translations of the commentary, unfortunately. But in this new book, Roots of Yoga, Mallinson does translate quite a few sections of that commentary. So, and that translation is very, very good indeed, and it's very readable, which is the main difference. And so I enjoy Mallinson's work partially because he is a scholar practitioner like myself, and he brings the practitioner's interest to his translation. And by that I mean he strives for clarity in the translation, such that if somebody is actually, doing these practices, they might be able to actually do them correctly, because again, there are many translations which have value but are still not very clear from a practitioner point of view. So now, what do we find when we look at this commentary? We find a number of interesting things. And the first thing I want to address is that there's a popular misconception about what the word yoga actually means, with reference to the Yoga-Sutra at least. This is very fascinating to me, that there can be sort of entrenched dogmas about the meaning of certain words and certain texts that are not actually supported by the source itself when you look more closely at it. And in particular, the dogma I have in mind is the notion that yoga is a practice as opposed to a word that describes a particular state of consciousness. Now, of course, the word yoga does often refer to a practice, but mostly in much later texts. If we look at the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga-Sutra, we find the word yoga being used most often in the sense of a state of consciousness. In other words, the word yoga refers to the goal of the practice much more often than the practice itself, at least in the classical period. And that's true for quite some time. And then it cut, by synecdoche. Synecdoche is a semantic extension whereby the word denoting one aspect of something comes to denote another aspect as well. That's one version of synecdoche. In this case, the word yoga denotes the goal of the practice, and then by extension comes to denote the practice which leads to that goal. Now, people have some kind of mostly unconscious awareness of this, in the sense that they say, well, yoga means union. This is the most popular definition in the modern postural yoga world. Yoga means union. And that, of course, describes a state, the goal of the practice, not the practice itself. Now, unfortunately, this is not actually what yoga means with reference to the Yoga-Sutra. And I say unfortunate only because in modern postural yoga, the Yoga-Sutra is held up as the paradigmatic text, as the ur-text, the source text. And indeed, in modern India, Patanjali is called the father of modern yoga, or the grandfather sometimes. So if you're going to hold up the Yoga-Sutra as the paradigmatic text, then it doesn't make sense that your main definition of yoga is precisely not the one used by that very text. So nowhere in the Yoga-Sutra do we find the word yoga used in the sense of union. Absolutely nowhere. So now there's nothing wrong with defining yoga as union, because in other sources we find precisely that definition. And I want to bring your attention to a text you might not have heard of. And this is called the Pashupata Sutra. And this is a text on yoga. The first verse declares that the first sutra declares that it teaches the yoga vidhi, the process that leads to the state of yoga, as taught by Pashupati, and that's a name of Shiva. It's said to be a revealed text in that sense, revealed by God. Now, the date of the Pashupata Sutra is, we think, about 150, maybe 175. Very, very, very early indeed. Earlier than many parts of the Mahabharata, a bit later than the Bhagavad Gita, but certainly earlier than the Yoga-Sutra. So about 3 centuries before the Yoga-Sutra, we find this text, the Pashupata Sutra. Now, the Pashupata Sutra itself defines yoga, it gives a definition, and it says it is Atma-ishvara Samyoga. That's what yoga means. Atma-ishvara Samyoga. Now, Samyoga clarifies the meaning of yoga, and Samyoga means union, very clearly, a union or communion, one or the other, and Atman, self or soul, Ishvara, God. So in the Pashupata Sutra, yoga is specifically and clearly defined as the union or communion of the individual soul and God.